In this video, we'll discuss a concept called fold equity. Normally when you hear fold equity thrown around in poker circles, people are talking about the secondary definition. We'll call that definition 2. They're saying whether or not you have the power to induce your opponent to fold. Do you have the ability to encourage your opponent to fold if you bet? This usually comes up when people say you don't have this power. They say you don't have fold equity against your opponent. A situation where this is the case is if your opponent's stack is really small relative to the blinds. A bet from you is sort of irrelevant to what he's going to decide to do. He has this really crucial external factor, which is his tournament life, and he's going to get blinded away if he doesn't make a move soon. So he's going to be thinking more about the blinds and his cards more than your actions. Another time people say you don't have fold equity is when your stack, relative to your opponent's stack, is very small, usually 10% or less. And you don't have fold equity here because if your opponent calls and loses, his stack is effectively the same size. He's not that worried about losing the top 10% of his chips. Hence, he's more thinking about his own pot equity against your range and whether he can win. If that's the casual definition of fold equity, what's the formal definition? It's a more mathematical definition. It's a more difficult concept to understand, and I think that's why people usually talk about definition 2. It's just not that easy to find somebody who can banter with you about this real version of pot equity. It's the percent chance that your opponent folds times the increase in equity that you gain from a fold. Another way to say the second part of this equation is, what was your opponent's pot equity in the hand before you induced the fold? So if he had a 50% chance of winning the hand by the river, that second part of the equation is just 50%. You might notice that this equation means your hand is instantly more valuable if when you bet, your opponent even has a 1% chance of folding. Our new equity equation then would be, we'll call it equity hat. It would be that standard pot equity we taught you about in our pot odds and hand equity video, plus this new concept of fold equity. And this is really great news. The value of your hand will instantly go up if you think there's a reasonable chance that your opponent will fold to that bet. Let's work through an example to make this clear, because it's a difficult concept, but it's crucial if you want to become an excellent poker player. Let's say you have ace-6, and your opponent has pocket 2s. But the flop comes out 9-7-3, so your opponent is actually way ahead. You're only going to win this by the river 31.5% of the time. Your opponent's got the other 68.5% in equity. But he has bottom pair to the board, an under pair. So it's reasonable that you have a pair of 9s, a 7, or a 3. Something that beats him now and is way ahead. He only would be drawing in that case to 2 outs, 2 2s. So a bet from you is going to make him unhappy. He's going to fold more often than not, some percent of the time. And in this case, we've determined our opponent will fold 7 out of 10 times. The other 3 times he's either on tilt or he's curious what we'll do on the river, whatever. But because he folds, because there's this 70% chance that he'll fold, and he has equity in the hand before he folds, we get to add fold equity to our overall equity valuation. And let's do the math. His equity was 68%, so we'll add that to our 31.5%, but we can't add all of it. We can only add 70% of it. We'll multiply by 0.7. So our resulting equity in the hand, when we consider this chance that he'll fold, is a whopping 79%, which is quite amazing. We more than doubled our equity in the hand just by being aggressive. Likewise, our opponent now only has the remaining 21%. And this is pretty good evidence as to why playing pocket twos and pocket threes is not really valuable, even for set farming, because situations like this arise where you just can't continue when bet two. I don't expect you to totally understand what fold equity is yet. We're throwing a lot of percentages around, so let's do a second example where we just use chip values. Let's say the pot is 400. If you had 25% equity in the hand, that's like saying that you deserve 100 of those chips. If you played this hand out 1,000,000 times, you deserve 100 of them. Your opponent, he deserves the other 300, and that's not great news to you, right? He's ahead in the hand. These chip counts represent our pot equity, or that standard hand equity that we taught in a previous video. But in this particular hand, if you bet, your opponent's going to get scared, and a certain percentage of the time, he's going to fold to you. That means we have fold equity. Congratulations. What percent of the time will he fold? Half the time. We multiply that 50% chance that he folds by his equity pre-fold. So that 300 chips that he deserves, he's going to send half of them to us on average. He's going to ship 150 chips to us. So our new equity is 250. And his new equity, because he's weak, whatever, he's scared of us, he has a hand that, like a underpair to the board or a weak mid pair with a bad kicker, he has to fold a lot. So his hand's really only worth 150 of those 400 chips right now. This is our equity hat, the new way that you should be considering equity. You might have heard that aggression in poker is good. And it's often misinterpreted as bluffing a lot or check raising a lot. Doing fancy plays with a lot of your chips is aggression. But what people really are talking about is this idea of fold equity. That by betting, you can instantly increase the value of your hand because there's a chance that your opponent will fold. That's why aggression is good in poker, because of fold equity.